Hey everybody, my name is Jonathan Core, and in today's marketing talk, I'm going to be talking to the founder of B2H Agency based out of Portland, Oregon. My guest today, Brendan Dell, has built 6, 7, and 8 figures in growth for fast-growing startups and enterprise brands like Cvent, Expedia Group, and Panasonic, just to name a few. Thanks for hopping on this call, Brendan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, let's kick this off right away. A common question I've been asking all my guests, given the current pandemic is, how are you doing as a business owner, as a marketer during COVID-19? Has it affected you much in your business? And if so, how are you adapting?
So the pandemic did affect us early on. Most of our clients are in tech, so it sort of hit some sectors hard, and it sort of boosted things for other sectors. So early on, everybody kind of took a big pause because I think nobody was sure what exactly was going to happen. You just mentioned two clients, Cvent and Expedia, they're companies who are obviously particularly impacted by all this. So there was a big, question of how bad is this going to be? How long is it going to take? What's the rebound look like? What's the strategy going to be? Slowly, we are kind of crawling out of things now, and other sectors of the market have picked up. People selling for remote work, people selling for home office, people are, different areas, and a lot of B2B SaaS is just kind of continuing along. So all in all, we're sort of like, we went down, but are trending back up, which is good.
So, from a business perspective, and also too from a relational aspect, how have you had those conversations? How have you started them? I've heard different agency or businesses finding ways to reach out and really understand how their customers are doing. How did you do it initially when it started affecting more of your business? How were those conversations like?
Yeah, a lot of it for me at the beginning was just how are you going to be there and be valuable for people and not push people. Like it's easy to want the short term gain, the short term win, but a lot of the people I worked with, if people I've worked with for years, I really like them as people. I value them, and so I don't want to push people in general into doing. I want them to do what's right for them, for the business, for their careers, all those sorts of things. So it was about like, how can we be helpful? If you need to take a beat, take a beat, and it was that was the focus.
Yeah, and it makes sense. Just kind of like putting an emphasis on what you mentioned is focusing more on the long term. I think that's really important. I find myself, especially right now, we're still in the middle of the pandemic, just finding ways like, is there any way I can do anything? But I have to always remind myself, what's the long term effect or outcome if I go this route. So that's really insightful, and it helps paint a bigger picture as far as how you guys are adapting. So let's take a leap backwards. So I had gone on your LinkedIn, and I had saw that you initially had started in commercial real estate. And so
Mhm.
I'm curious, what was you worked for two different companies. What was that experience like, and how did that eventually pivot and evolve into more of a marketing role, with different companies, and then now, having your own company?
Yeah, so that started. So the real estate was basically direct sales, and I started out working for some folks. It was brokerage, and the first company was industrial brokerage in LA, and the second did large tenant representation, which is like helping put companies into office space on the west side of LA. And it was really about sales, and the way it all pivoted to marketing. So first of all, I think everybody should have two jobs early on in life. One is working in a restaurant, the other is in sales of some kind, because I think you learn things about people and how to be out there in front of people in a way that you don't get in a lot of other ways. But the real estate job was basically, they had me cold calling, right? It was going up and down office buildings and try to find us deals. I hated that. I thought it was terribly inefficient. Nobody wants you there. They're throwing you out of their office. And so it was like there's got to be a better way kind of thing. And I think I found the Dan Kennedy book, The Ultimate Sales Letter. And I was like, okay, what if I made a sales letter instead? Could I use this to do biz dev instead of walking room to room to room? And long story short, I ended up getting like $50 million in business for these brokers out of this like multi-touch campaign I put together. And then I was like, whoa, there's power in this. Like if you can do this well, there's a lot of power in this. And so I started walking that story around to clients, and it's just grown over time.
So I'm curious, just like right away, what was the response like from your employer? Like, what did they say when they, when everything kind of just eventually closed, and you saw that there was like a $50 million, total deal or revenue, that you accumulated? What was that
So
conversation like?
$50 million in lease value, not 50
Lease Valley.
million in
Oh,
lease
okay.
value. So caveat, but it was a big deal. It was a lot of
Yeah.
commission. The What was their response? They were like, "Holy shit!" at first, and then and then they were sort of like, they were not wonderful people. They were sort of trying to be like, "Oh well, you know." Anyway, they were trying to figure out how to make sure they kept the largest piece of the pie. Is what it came in.
No, that's really interesting. So, how did like were there any other pieces that played a part in you learning marketing outside of that Dan Kennedy book? Like, what were some of the books, courses, resources that you used to pivot into marketing?
So I've read it all over time, and I think I sort of started at the beginning with scientific advertising, Claude Hopkins and all that. Went through all the direct response stuff that you can find. Um, I would read old magalogs, seeing like what performed, going through everything. I was talking about this yesterday, that at one point I was even like writing direct response. Like, so Hunter Thompson would talk about how he would actually type out Faulkner, right, to see how the words flowed and how it felt. So I would go and write stuff that I knew performed really well, just copy it, just to see how it felt and how it flowed. And then over time, I've read a lot of others, Seth Godin. I really like his stuff. Um, I think there's a lot of stuff on psychology out there that's really useful to understand how people think about the world. Um, and then things like Gary Bencivenga's breakthrough seminars, I think, is really useful to think about. He says desire is infinite. And so I always think about that with people, that whatever we get, whatever it is we think we want, there's something else that we want.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you were saying, like, even like kind of touching back on the sales piece. Outside of those books, like that you had mentioned, those resources that helped you become a better marketer. Why do you think people should have sales experience, or like that? Maybe working in a restaurant. How has that helped you as a marketer? Because I know a lot of marketers who don't have a sales background or who don't have that experience go directly into marketing, and maybe has provided you a different outlook on how to approach marketing to potential prospects or buyers.
Well, one is just life skill, in that early on I was just uncomfortable selling, meeting new people, all of that, talking to people, and being in a restaurant. You have to deal with difficult people. You're on a tiny little miniature stage, right, for every little table that you have to go up there and do your spiel and then get them their stuff. And sales is the same thing, right? You're dealing with a lot of rejection. You have to learn how to deal with people. You have to learn how to talk to people, and you learn what people want, and what it really is like on the back end of the marketing, right? What do the conversations actually look like? And so all of that just better equips you, whether you want to go in your own business, or it just better equips you to deal with people, to deal with rejection, to deal with adversity, and to just sort of like be a more confident human being.
So what's your outlook now on sales? You mentioned back then you didn't like it, you hated it. What is it like now as a business owner and having had all this experience up to this point?
I like sales. Um, it's one of my favorite things about about running a business. And I think when you approach it from the perspective of you you should always sell something that you believe in. So if you believe that you can do good things and you believe that you can help people, then you always approach it from the perspective of, how am I going to help these people? And it's a disservice, right? If you believe you do a good job and you're talking to the right person, they have a problem you can solve, it's a disservice to not help them understand the way that you can help improve their business. So I think I always just come in it from helping people, and um, so I enjoy it then.
That's really encouraging to hear, because I was along the same lines. I had worked retail as well, and I just remember anytime my manager would come out with this little big stack of just PDF files that had numbers, we knew we had cold calling to do that day, and I just remember just trying to speed through my whole pitch. And
Yeah.
then, like, it's funny because several times you're like, sorry, I didn't even understand what you said. I'm like, oh my God, I got to do it again. And so, yeah, but now I'm kind of falling in the same line as, like, I am enjoying it. I'm seeing it less as like I'm selling people to sell, as opposed to like I'm selling something that will solve the problem that they have. So I think that, shift in mindset for sure helps. So what did you do specifically after, being in commercial real estate? Like, how were you freelancing right out, or did you work for other businesses doing marketing, or how was that eventual,
Yeah.
like,
So
what was the
I was,
trajectory?
yeah, I was freelancing, um, and sort of walk myself around in a big leap, and actually something that I recommend for anybody who like maybe doesn't want to necessarily get a job for someone but wants to learn, is to find a really smart agency somewhere, or really, or a really smart marketer, and go like get in there at like 2/3 of your time. For me, there was a company, there's a guy named Troy O'Brien who works at Expedia now, all these years later, and he ran a company called Response Capture, and that was an agency back then that he eventually sold. And he was incredibly bright with marketing, and then that was one of the sort of the first in the trenches experiences I had, and exposed me to a lot, and I learned a lot that you can't get out of books, right? That you're going to have to learn by doing, as well as like dealing with people, which is like 2/3 of the job. um, and so I think that that was sort of what I started doing afterwards. Over time, I just started taking the wins that I had, walking them around to clients that looked similar, and being open to opportunity, and continuing to talk to more people. And I think something I tell people all the time is, if you just meet with 2 people a week who have the budget authority need for what you do, and listen to their problems and come up with solutions to help, yeah, you probably got a business.
So just to unpack that a little bit, like, if maybe you could explain a little bit how that relationship happened with the guy who had initially owned an agency but is now working at Expedia. Talk a little bit about how that happened, and also to maybe some tips or advice on how, potential freelancers or people who have already, started to grow their own business, can actually tactically do that.
So that relationship came, like most relationships do, from my broader network of meeting with people and saying, this is who I help and how I help them, and then someone saying, oh, you should meet Troy. He worked in a similar space, and he's worked, he helps people with similar things, and maybe there's an opportunity to collaborate. He needed the skill, that I have. And I think the second part of the question was, how do they create something like that for themselves?
Yeah, like what are some practical tips or advice you would recommend, whether it's on LinkedIn or cold outreach through phone or email? Like, what advice would you give somebody out there?
Well, first of all, I think something I always tell freelancers is not to think of yourself as a freelancer, but think of yourself as a business owner, right? You own a business. So that means thinking about what's in it for the other person. And through all the years I worked with Troy, and I do this with all my clients today, I'm always like, how does this become a win for him? Like for him or her, or whomever. And so whenever the way I set my rates, the way I worked on projects, I was always thinking about what gets more work for the business, right? How do we sell more work to his clients? How do you make it a win for both sides? And I think if you can go into relationships thinking about what's in it for them, and always be thinking about putting their interests first, you're going to be more successful. And I think tactically, something we do in coaching with folks is we talk about your advantage inventory, which is everybody has, first of all, a sweet spot for you, construction as an example of place that you can have a disproportionately large benefit for people. And they also usually have a network around that. But what people often do is they go to cold, right? The first thing they do is go, okay, I'm going to start sending cold emails now because right? The best path is your network. So it's looking at, who do I know, who can they introduce me to, and how do I methodically expand through my network that's going to be everyone's fastest and most expeditious path uh, to growing and to money.
We've had a conversation in the past, and you had suggested even like finding ways to incentivize people through referrals. Could you talk a little bit about that? Like, like I guess giving people, like, how have you done it in the past, giving people a piece of the pie as you're building your, your business?
Yeah. So I think I've seen a lot of different ways of doing this, but I think simply put, it's just you give people, in exchange for referrals, and the way that we always phrase it is, hey, I know that you're not sending us referrals as a result of money, but the way we say thank you to people is not just by saying thank you, it's by writing checks. And so for anyone that you send us, I know you think we do good work, but we'd be happy to either give you 10% of the SOW as a referral fee, or donate that to your favorite charity, like whatever is better for you, right? Whatever you prefer. And I think it just incentivizes it. And for me, giving people a recurring source of that revenue, right, giving it for the life of the client, allows you to stay top of mind and say thank you to people who support your business, because none of us grow on our own. And if you can, it can be mutually beneficial. That's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I really like that piece. So you mentioned earlier when you're talking about freelancing, to have freelancers not think of themselves as freelancers and more as businesses. What are two or three other maybe misconceptions that people have about freelancing, or like just yeah, speaking to that in particular, because sometimes some people think they know what's best, and I'm sure there's a lot of roads that you went down through or down that you realize, yeah, I probably shouldn't have gone that route. So what are two or three misconceptions people have, or approaches that people have towards freelancing?
So I think a lot of it comes down to the biggest problem I see is internal versus external. They spin over what's the right package, what's the right client, what's the right outright, what's the perfect this or that. But the answer is there isn't. And instead being external, right, and defaulting to action, to saying, I have this idea, I'm going to try it, and getting out there and putting your ideas into practice is going to net you much faster gains. And I think there's a lot of bad information out there around people. You need to pick a niche, you need to have a signature package, you need to have these things. And there's nothing wrong with productizing your services, but the reality is if you look at most large agencies, right, which is essentially your tiny little agency, if you're a freelancer, right, you wouldn't go on, I don't know, 72 and Sunny's website and see like, click here to buy my signature package, right? No, you're going to have a conversation with a buyer about a need, and you're going to come up with a solution to help them. And it's going to be the same thing most of the time. And same with an architect, right? Your professional service provider. So overthinking some of this stuff is bad advice, and it nets people to miss opportunities that if they were just willing to stretch themselves a little bit and be helpful.
So have you, and I think that's really interesting. I want to have a little bit of conversation on this. Have you had, you're basically saying one size fits, doesn't fit all, and like it's all dependent on the needs of your customer. So you're looking to solve however that looks. You're looking to do that for them. Have you run into any issues, when it comes to scaling? Like, some people try to be everything for everyone and by themselves, and end up kind of pigeonholing themselves. And so how do you balance that kind of paradigm?
Well, if you want to scale and your goal is scale, you need to get some kind of recurring revenue model, or you need to sell large enough projects that you can support a staff with wiggle room, So that it really comes down to one of those two things. And I don't necessarily think for most people that the way to scale is with bodies. The way to scale is with charging more, to finding ways to provide more value based on your skill set to a specific person, and learning how to position that value so the buyer sees it, right? So let's take copywriting. One way to go to market as a copywriter is to say, I'm a copywriter, and copywriters charge between $50 and $100 an hour. So I'll pick the middle number. I'll charge $75 an hour because it's not too high and not too low. And you tell me what you want, and I'll tell you how long it took, right? Another way to go to market as a copywriter is to say the function of copywriting is to increase responses to critical customer-facing marketing materials. It's to align a company around a story, right, that they can bring to market. It's to build scale, like all these different things, right? And so when you come to a conversation with a company about what are you trying to do, it's what are your actual growth goals? What do your metrics look like today, right? And you take a consultative approach to solving. Now, if you have a $10 million business or a $50 million business who's trying to make a 10% improvement, all of a sudden makes a lot of sense to charge 100 grand for something, right? Because you're looking at a very small lift compared to the delta you're trying to drive. So scale does not necessarily have to come from adding bodies to process. It can come from contextualizing value.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful, and obviously you have the experience from a freelancing, aspect, and so right now you have your own business, you have your own podcast, you have a blog, you have all these means of putting out content, and you recently started, I would say, over the past few months, the Daily Creative, which is inspiration, resources, and tools for freelancers. I'm subscribed to it. I actually recently read your ebook on fear and dare. That whole model was really interesting and really insightful for me. But I'm curious, like you have so much so much on your plate and so many different things moving. What inspired you to start this?
Mainly that I think people are being given a lot of bad information by people who have no practical experience doing this stuff and who want to create a linear vision of success when it actually looks like this. It's a messy process, and they want to paint like a straight arrow up and to the left. And I think a lot of people um, quit too early because they don't know what like the realistic process looks like. The second piece of it is, I think it's a really, being in your own business, I think is a wonderful way to make money, help people, be creative, but you're often alone in it. So I wanted to create a community where people can come together and have access to each other, right? Like I can't tell you how many times I've driven my wife nuts getting her to read proposals or something else, right? Where you need a sounding board, and like she doesn't want to read this stuff. So, but what if I had like a bunch of other people that were like me that I could share, proposals with, ideas, etc., and we could all help to lift each other up. So that was where the idea came from, right? Is to create for those two reasons.
I like the piece about building community. That I actually find myself doing that right now, specifically with my wife. Hey, come and read this, or hey, come review this, and so sometimes I'm having to explain what it means and educate her a little bit. But does this make sense? Am I getting the point across? So I can completely relate. I think I'm curious. Once my wife goes back, I'm sure that'll be very different because she won't be here anymore, and so I'm sure I'll experience a lot more alone time. So I'm curious how I'll process that. But I'm glad I'm subscribed. And if any of you guys are curious, is it the dailycreative.com? Is that what it is?
Thedailycreative.com.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great resource. It's been really insightful for me up to this point. So now transitioning into the agency, I've alluded to it several times throughout this conversation. So right now you have your agency based out of Portland, Oregon, called B2H Agency. My first question is, why did you decide to go with that name for your agency?
So business to human is what that stands for, and basically, uh, our perspective is that yeah, you're selling to companies, but you're selling to people first. And the stuff that really moves the needle is when you can really understand who those people are really well and reach them in an emotional way, in a way that allows them to see a better version of themselves, what you're promising. And so that was core to the way that we see the world. And so we wanted it to be reflected in the name.
And when I was reading the way you explain BDH on your LinkedIn and on the actual profile is, BDH focuses on growing revenue and reducing CAC. What is the high level view or the framework or approach that, that actually plays out within your agency?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that go in there, but it essentially comes down to three things. One, how are you going to tell a story that positions you as a must have given this environment right now, whenever this is, right? We happen to be in a sort of very unique situation right now, but whenever this is, right? Because getting that message right first is primary. Second, how are you going to amplify that? What does the content look like, and how are you going to get yourself out there as different in a world that's largely seen as the same? And then third, how are you going to distribute that content in a way that builds you an audience, not just attracts leads, right? So how are you building an asset in marketing, not just a transaction?
So with those 3 points, what trend have you noticed? Like, what are some of the, like, kind of common threads that you notice within different companies that you're working with, that you're seeing do wrong, that you kind of help correct? But just like, not even how you guys go through the process, but more specific, like, what are some of those trends that you notice on what companies focus on that they should really not be focusing on, and instead shift their focus towards, whatever that is?
So one of the things I'm seeing start to happen in B2B that I think there needs to be more of is people need to prioritize the brand. And if you build the brand, all the demand becomes easier. There's a study recently by Field and Burnett, I think it was, that said 46% of spend should be on brand, and then the other 56% should be on demand. And I think when we say brand, it's not just a big company thing where we run TV commercials. It's how do you help people remember something about you that's going to be unique, so that when sales reaches out, when they get the email, when they see the ad, right, they have an opinion, they have some emotional connection to you. And that's a way, so we know that 95% of buying is done subconsciously, right? This is why Drift and Gong and all that, you see these like hyper growth startups. And then on the enterprise side, like Vonage is doing this really well. Companies are prioritizing this emotional connection, but I think the broader market often misses that. Cvent as a company, as a client of ours, is an example of someone who does that really, really well.
Yeah, it's just some of those companies that you mentioned already. I'm for sure seeing that. Like, I remember when I first heard about those companies, I'm like, I don't even know what they do, but like, I see a lot more thought leadership. I'm seeing a lot more, people, like, I guess employees within their company posting their own content or having other means of, like, podcasts or, different ventures that they're doing, that's attracting more, visitors, or just more awareness to the brand. So I think one, I don't know if you have actually seen them. They're from here in Seattle. They're called Outreach,
Yeah.
Outreach.io. Yeah. And so they've actually, like, been one company I've just kind of been seeing. I'm not in sales or sales enablement, but it's just interesting how active and how they're actually starting to build the brand as they're, looking to scale. So did you currently have employees within your, like, or like just a team within your agency right now?
Yeah, so we operate a small team, and then what I do is I keep a team of creatives around me that sort of are creatives, technologists, people that we work with on an ongoing basis, and we sort of bring them in depending on what capabilities are needed. We run the business very much like what I said, in terms of you, that what we want to do is create impact for a smaller number of organizations versus try to create some big machine that churns out a sort of widget that is not that useful for people.
And the reason I asked this question is, what's it been like for you from a fulfillment standpoint, from a, like, when you first started off by yourself, working as a freelancer, and then eventually evolving into this, group, this team, looks like just a network that, you're looking and building and ultimately helping other businesses grow. How has that been from a more, like, fulfillment standpoint, from your perspective?
You
Huh?
mean getting the work done?
Well, just like from going, like, from being a freelancer by yourself
Oh,
to having
fulfillment. I mean, my
yeah, yeah,
personal fulfillment. Got it. I think
exactly.
about
Yeah, yeah.
fulfillment of the work.
No, no,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, good question. So I think collaborating with people is the most fun way to make things. I mean, it creates more conflict too, right? Because you have disagreements. But I think you always make better stuff when you work in teams. So I think finding really bright people who are really good at what they do and bringing them together towards a common objective is the most fun way to do things. And I think even stuff that seems like a solo effort, like if you look to art, like books or songs, it really, it's not just the author, it's not just Justin Bieber or whoever. There's a whole team that are engineering this experience of what you ultimately get. And, the artist may have the kernel, but it gets molded by this team, and it gets better because of the team. And I think that's true with marketing and with businesses and things in general.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen that very much. So I have a music background, so that all that makes sense. Just architecting everything together to ultimately, I guess, release the finished product, but a lot of people don't see the behind the scene things, that go into creating that. So that's really insightful. So if you were to ask yourself, or if you were to look back, you know, early 2000s, early mid 2000s, when you initially started in commercial real estate, but then pivoted towards marketing, what sort of advice or feedback would you give to Brendan then, based off of all the experience, knowledge, and just, yeah, I would just say experience that you've gained up to this point?
Well, that's a deep one. Advice would I give to me back then? I think the number one thing I would say back then is prioritize the long term, right? Like, don't look at the win you're going to get this week or this month, and don't shy away from the big goal because it seems like it's going to take 10 years. Dig in and just be willing to put in the time and the work to take one step up the hill and another, and just keep climbing until you get where you want to go, and don't worry about the short term stuff.
Long-term focus. So now, as I transition into the last part of this conversation in the rapid fire question, the first question I want to ask you is, in your agency, or maybe even just yourself as you're working, what has been your favorite marketing tool or software that you've had up to this point?
Favorite marketing tool or software? I don't have a good answer for tool or software, honestly. I mean, the thing I use, for myself the most is like, it's not a marketing tool or software, but it's Google, Google Docs in terms of like coming up with client stuff. But I think, yeah, I don't have a good answer for that one.
And you do copywriting. This is kind of unpacking a little bit of that. Do you do all your copy for LinkedIn and stuff like that? Do you do it on a Google Doc, or how do you write all that stuff? Is it just natively on LinkedIn?
No, I have a list running in Google Doc and in Evernote. And unfortunately, it's not as organized as it should be, but there's like all this smattering of stuff everywhere, and then I go find it.
Yep. So I would say that's a good marketing tool, even though it doesn't say or have an affiliation direct with marketing. Yeah, I think that's good. So what's your so you mentioned several courses and different marketers that you've studied. What's been one of your most favorite online marketing courses that you've taken?
Online marketing courses. So it's not, I don't know if it's a course, but Gary Bencivenga's breakthrough seminar, I think, was one of the things I listened to that really got me thinking about how people are wired. And he was giving a speech to the Direct Marketing Association at the end of it, talking about, he was being inducted to the Hall of Fame or something, and he was talking about how people are wired. And I think if you can dig that up, it's just really insightful to think about how we're all wired, and what makes us tick. Um, yeah, so I really like that.
Cool. Yeah, I'll see if I can do some digging and find a link somewhere and add it in the show notes. So now, what's been your favorite business or marketing book that you've read up to this point?
Business or marketing book. So the marketing, I think, is Seth Godin's All Marketers Are Liars, or Tell Stories. And I think when I was reading the anecdote in the beginning there, it's talking about Rydell glassware, and how if you ask people who drink wine if it tastes better out of Rydell glassware, right? Like, they say, yes, it gives it better flavor. But if you do a blind test, there's no difference, even with people who are big into wine. It made me think about how much the story really matters, right? How much it's not what's true, it's what people believe. And on the business side, I really like, extreme ownership is one that I really like. And I think just thinking about keeping things simple, having plans, understanding, how to try to organize small teams around a goal, um, is something I'm not great at, but continue to try to improve at.
Two great books right there. I've read both of those myself, but I'll add that in the show notes as well. Now, the final question for the rapid fire question is, who is your favorite marketer, whether it be somebody you know personally or someone you've admired from afar?
Who is my favorite marketer? So I don't know if he's my favorite, but I think if you look at Jocko Willink, who we just talked about, he's not a marketer, But you talk about a guy who has created a brand, who stays on brand, who differentiates himself, who zigs when other people zag. In the 12 immutable laws, we talk about a lot of this stuff, that my book on messaging. Everybody says make a short podcast. His podcast is 4 hours long, right? Everybody says don't number your podcast. iTunes doesn't like it. He numbers. That's basically all he does. He talks about what he wants to talk about. Everything is black and white. If you see it, it feels like something from Jocko Willink, right? You don't have to question. You can see it in a YouTube feed. I think that's an example of, being a marketer without trying to be, without a focus on the marketing, with focusing on building an image and a personality and a product that you believe in, and delivering in a consistent way to people.
Yeah, I like that correlation. And one thing I actually, I'm supposed to ask the last question here. I just want to have one last question. So you alluded, so you have a book, and I remember when I was doing my research, I saw that. But you have a book, you have a business, you have a podcast, you have a blog. Brendan, how do you do all this, man?
Well, it's too many hours is the real answer. Staring at your computer a lot is the real answer. Yeah.
That's awesome. And it's really encouraging to hear, though, just like, seeing all the success, and obviously having had connected with you initially on LinkedIn, and then just seeing how you're, beginning to grow, at least have some traction. And looks like you've been posting on LinkedIn, more recently within the past few months or few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, man, just keep it up. And I really appreciate you, hopping on this call. So if people are interested in connecting with you, obviously there's a lot of ways for them to connect with you. You have several websites, different means, but what are some of the, top 2 methods for them to connect with you if they have more questions or want to learn more about what you're doing?
So they can find me on LinkedIn, Brendan Dell. That's the socials where I'm active. They can find the Daily Creative if you're interested in that sort of thing, www.thedailycreative.com. And our agency is www.B2H,
Great. Well, thank you very much, Brendan, for hopping on this call and sharing your knowledge, resources, experience to me and to the marketing community.
Hey, appreciate you having me.
Also, if you haven't yet, please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. And also in the comment section, I want to ask you guys, what's been the biggest takeaway you got from my conversation from Brendan today? And if you can think of something right away, feel free to comment down below. So take care, and we'll talk to you next time.